summer of 1971, I was at Arrowhead Springs, and there was a young lady who came to me for counsel. She had been dating my best friend, Randy, and she was a good friend. Her name was Barbara Peterson. And Barbara was just unsure about this relationship she had with my best friend, and she came to me for advice. And honestly, he'd kind of been hot and cold in the relationship. He'd wanted to marry her and ask her to marry her and then retreated, and he'd kind of dated some other girls perhaps at the same time as he was dating her. And she really needed some outside counsel. And because I knew him and knew her and we were good friends, she came to me for counsel. And I told her two things that she said later on meant a great deal to her. Number one, I asked her a question: do you believe God could give you someone else later on that you could love more than Randy? And she thought, yeah, that makes sense. God's big enough to give me somebody else later on I could love more than him. Then a second thing I told her was in the form of a parable. And basically the parable was of a little boy named Johnny, 4, maybe 5 years of age, playing in the dirt, playing some marbles in the front lawn. And his uncle drove up and went out and played marbles with him for a few moments, and then looked him in the eye and said, "Johnny boy." And he reached in his pocket and he pulled out a dime and a dollar. And he said, "Johnny boy, would you like a dime today or a dollar next week?" And Johnny thought about it for a moment. His eyes danced back and forth between the shiny dime and the crisp dollar, and he thought about what they'd buy and how that dime would buy a package of potato chips. That's back when it would buy that. Or that dollar would buy a rubber ball. And he was hit with a hunger pain, and so he reached up with his grubby, dirty fingers and took the dime and went out and bought the package of potato chips and wolfed them down, and they were delicious, they were great. Well, next week rolled around, and everybody on Johnny's block had, guess what? A rubber ball. So Johnny got on his bicycle, screamed over to his uncle's house, knocked on the door, looked up at his uncle and says, "Hey, Unc, how about that dollar you promised me?" His uncle looked over his bifocals and said, Johnny boy, I told you you could have a dime today or a dollar next week. You took the dime, you can't have the dollar." And so I told this young lady I was counseling, I said, "Do you believe that perhaps this guy is a dime and God has a dollar for you later on?" Well, this is a true story, and God knows my motives. 1 year later, she would become my wife. And you're looking at the dollar right here. Now, I realize there's been a lot of inflation since then in more ways than one, but the fun thing about that story is my motives, as much as I know them, were really pure. I wanted to give her the advice of waiting for God's best. And Barbara and I started our marriage together at that time, and really the way I'd like to describe it, we began the journey of a lifetime.